The secret I kept from my husband wasn't the kind women keep out of cruelty. It was the kind we keep out of survival. And the morning he found out, I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the frost melt off the glass, thinking that some things, once they leave your mouth, can never be put back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I go any further, I have to say something honest. More than 90% of the people watching this right now haven't subscribed yet. And every time I think about that, I think about all the women sitting alone somewhere, listening to these stories in secret, the way I used to read by candlelight when Jonas thought I was already asleep. If these stories have ever made you feel less alone, please subscribe. It's completely free, and it keeps these words alive for the next woman who needs them. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, have you ever kept a secret not to protect yourself, but to protect the only life you knew how to live? Because that is exactly what I did. My name is Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where the things Amish women were never supposed to say out loud finally get said. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio. I married at 19, I left at 26, and in the 7 years between those two facts, I kept one secret, so carefully, so quietly, so completely hidden inside the ordinary movements of my days, that by the end, I had almost convinced myself it wasn't real. I need you to stay with me here, because the secret itself won't make sense until you understand what kind of woman I had been trained to be. In my community, a wife's inner life was not considered her own. Not her thoughts about whether she was happy, not her private grief, not her doubts about the faith she had been born into and never once chosen. These things were not secrets, they were simply things that did not exist. A good Amish wife was a clear window. Light came through her. Nothing caught inside. I had been a clear window for 6 years. I had kept Jonas's house. I had raised our children. I had sat in church on the women's side with my hands folded and my face arranged into the expression that meant, all is well. Because in my community, the expression on a wife's face is a public statement about her husband's authority. And a wife whose face said something other than all is well was a wife who was already causing trouble. I was very careful with my face. What I was not careful with, what I had never been taught to guard, was my reading. This is where the secret begins. There was a box. An English woman named Carol, who sold quilts at the market where I brought our preserves every second Saturday, had left it at the end of the table one morning without explanation. She said only that she had been cleaning out her garage and thought perhaps I might find something useful inside. I loaded it into the back of the buggy under a canvas. I told myself I would look through it that evening and give most of it to the donation box at the church house. I did not give it to the donation box. Inside the box were 17 books. Not devotionals, not Bible commentaries, not the kind of plain literature the deacon's wife sometimes passed around about godly womanhood and submission with joy. These were regular books, novels, memoirs. One was a slim paperback with a woman's face on the cover, and the title was a question I had never heard anyone ask out loud. I cannot tell you the title today because to say it would be to say everything about what came after, and I need you to stay with me long enough to understand it properly. What I will tell you is that I read the first 3 pages standing in the barn with the box at my feet and the horses moving quietly in their stalls. And something happened behind my eyes that I did not have a word for. It felt like a window I had not known was painted shut, suddenly coming open in a wall I had lived beside my whole life. I hid the books under the loose board in the root cellar, beneath 2 burlap sacks of winter potatoes. I read them at night. Not every night. Some nights I was too exhausted. Some nights Jonas was still awake and I could not risk the candle. But on the nights when the house was quiet and the children were sleeping, and Jonas's breathing had slowed to the particular depth that meant he would not stir until morning, I would go downstairs in my bare feet on the cold wooden steps, and I would lower myself into the root cellar, and I would read. What I was reading was, by the standards of my community, unspeakable. Not immoral, not sinful in the way the bishop would have named sin, but something in many ways more threatening than immorality, because immorality could be confessed and forgiven and absorbed back into the community. What I was reading could not be confessed. It could only be hidden or acted upon. I was reading about women who had chosen. Women who had said, "This is what I want, and this is what I do not want, and those two things are equally mine to say." Women who had disagreed with their husbands and not been punished for it. Women who had built lives that looked nothing like the lives they had been handed, and who were not described in any page of any of those 17 books as having opened a door for the devil. I was 30 years old before I understood that women were allowed to want things. I know how that sounds to you. I know that if you grew up outside, if you grew up in a world where wanting things was simply called being a person, that sentence sounds impossible. But I need you to trust me when I tell you that the education I received, from the moment I was old enough to sit still in a church bench, was an education in the erasure of want. Good girls didn't want. Good women didn't need. Good wives gave and gave until there was nothing left, and then they gave the nothing. The books in the root cellar were the first thing I had ever wanted entirely for myself. And I guarded them the way you guard something you know will be taken from you the moment anyone else learns it exists. For 11 months, no one knew. Then Jonas found the loose board. He had gone into the root cellar in February for the last of the stored carrots, and he found it the way men find things they weren't looking for, by accident, by the particular creak of a board that didn't sound right underfoot. I was upstairs when I heard him call my name. Not loudly. Jonas almost never raised his voice. He called it the way he called everything, quietly, with a weight underneath the quiet that told you the quiet was doing the work the voice was not. I came to the top of the cellar steps and looked down. He was standing with one of the books in his hand, just holding it, looking at the cover. He had not opened it. He looked up at me, and his face was the face I had learned to read in 6 years of marriage the way other women read weather. And what it said was not anger. What it said was something I had no word for then, but that I would later, in a therapist's office in Worcester, Ohio, come to understand was the expression of a man realizing that the woman he had married had an interior life he had never been told to ask about and had never thought to. He said, "How long?" I said, 11 months. He said, "Where did you get them?" I said, "They were given to me." He set the book down on the cellar floor carefully, like it was something that needed to be handled without breaking, and he came up the steps past me, and he sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at his hands for a long time. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and I waited. I had spent 6 years learning to wait for what came after Jonas went quiet. What came after was not what I expected. He said, "Have you been happy here, Martha?" I had prepared myself for anger. I had prepared myself for the silence that meant community machinery was being set into motion. I had prepared myself for his mother, for the deacon, for the bishop's wife arriving with coffee and gentle devastation. I had not prepared myself for that question, because that question was not a question Amish husbands asked, and I did not know how to answer it, because the true answer was something I had spent 11 months learning in the root cellar and was not yet sure I was brave enough to say in the kitchen. I said, "I have been a good wife." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "I didn't ask you that." That was the moment the ground shifted. Not in the way I had always feared ground would shift, not with collapse and noise, and the community closing around me like a fist. It shifted quietly, the way frost shifts soil in early spring, underneath everything, invisibly, until one day you step on what you thought was solid and find it has been rearranged by something you couldn't see. I sat down across from him, and for the first time in our marriage, I told him the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but some of it. I told him that I had not known when I married him that there were other ways to live. I told him that I had not known when I married him that the life we were living was a choice and not simply the shape of things. I told him that the books had not made me want to leave him, that they had made me want something harder than leaving. They had made me want to be known. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said something I have turned over in my hands every day since, because I have never been sure whether it was a cruelty or a confession or simply the most honest thing Jonas ever said to me in our marriage. He said, "I didn't know you needed that." I said, "I didn't know I was allowed to." He got up from the table. He went back to the barn. He left the books in the cellar. I want to be careful about what I tell you happened next, because it was not a transformation. This was not the moment Jonas became a different man and our marriage became a different marriage, and we lived out the rest of our years in some new kind of plainness that had room in it for the woman I was slowly becoming. Life inside a closed community does not bend that way. The structures are too old and too load-bearing, and too many people are leaning on them. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, more painful than transformation. What happened was that Jonas knew. And Jonas knowing changed what I was hiding and changed what I was not. I could not unhide the books. I could not unhide the woman who had read them. But I also could not simply become her inside a life that had no architecture for her. So I kept reading, and Jonas never mentioned the cellar again. And we moved through our kitchen and our fields and our church Sundays and our long winters with this new silence between us, which was entirely different from the old silence, because the old silence had been about compliance. And this new silence was about something neither of us had language for. I left 2 years later. The leaving is a different story, and it belongs to a different video. But I will tell you this about what I carried out with me, beyond the suitcase and the 3 children and the heaviness of every shunning that followed. I carried the memory of Jonas's face in the root cellar holding that book. Not the anger I had expected, the bewilderment. The face of a man who had been handed a script for what a husband was and had followed it faithfully for years, and had arrived one February afternoon in a root cellar to discover that his wife had also been handed a script and had also followed it faithfully, and that neither of their scripts had contained a single line about who they actually were. My therapist, years later, said to me that what happened in my marriage was not exceptional. She said it is what happens inside any system that decides in advance what a woman is for. She said the secret I kept was not about disobedience. It was about self-preservation. It was the last small room in a house where everything else belonged to someone else. She said, "You kept a piece of yourself alive in that cellar, Martha." She said, "That's not a sin. That's survival." I think about Lydia sometimes, the woman who told me the truth at the barn raising, who said the things no one was supposed to say in the language no one was supposed to use. I think about what she would have said if I had told her about the books. I think she might have nodded. I think she might have looked at me with that look she had, sideways, that did not quite meet your eyes, and said something I would carry for years. I think she would have understood that some secrets are not kept from people. They are kept for ourselves. If any part of this story touched something you have been keeping quiet, please tell me in the comments. Tell me what you kept. Tell me what it cost you. Tell me if you still have it, that small room inside you that belongs only to you. Because I believe it is still there. I believe it survived everything they did to make you give it away. And if you want to keep hearing the stories from behind the prayer cap, the ones that were never supposed to leave the kitchen, the ones that were never supposed to travel as far as wherever you are sitting right now, please subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. Before you go, I want to say something from the heart. More than 90% of the people watching this right now have not subscribed yet. And I understand that. But if this story reached something in you, something quiet and stubborn and still alive after everything, I hope you will subscribe. It is completely free. It is just a way of saying, I am staying. I want to keep hearing. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you kept secret? Not to deceive anyone, but simply because it was the only thing that was entirely yours. Until next time, remember this. The things you hid in the dark to survive were not shameful. They were the proof that some part of you always knew you were worth saving.